This is a new video that just came out of the war in Ukraine showing a Russian fiber optic drone sneaking up on a group of Ukrainian soldiers next to the Bradley. I believe this was in Kursk. We're going to play this back here so we can look at it again, but a couple things to keep in mind. One, you wouldn't expect these soldiers to hear the drone. Bradleys are very loud even when they're idling, but you would expect a soldier to kind of be pulling forward security and watching for threats like this. Now, these fiber optic drones are kind of an interesting new addition to the war in Ukraine, and I've got another clip here showing this specific type of munition in action. I want you to focus on how clear this picture is, right? So these fiber optic drones, what they've done, both Russia and Ukraine at this point, is a major issue across the front is electronic warfare jamming, especially all drones, but definitely these FPV first-person drones with warheads attached like we're seeing in this video. So one way to overcome that is both sides have been attaching very, very lightweight fiber optic cables that prevents the radio signal from being jammed. However, there's some downsides, right? There's a very limited range that these munitions will be able to carry. You know, a tow missile, for instance, can go out to about 4 kilometers. So got to think on or about 4K range, maybe. Obviously, the image here is much more clear, but also you have to consider power lines and trees could snag on that wire and bring it down. So it's effective, but definitely some limited use cases. Now, as a comparison, this is what the traditional FPV view looks like. So I just want you to see kind of the grainy nature of these images. And this is still primarily what's being used by both sides in the war. But the fiber optic drones, you can tell very quickly when you're looking at a fiber optic versus a traditional FPV. So here again, we have, this is actually a really interesting clip. Not going to know what happens until the very end, but this is another fiber optic drone. You can see how clear that picture is. Now in this case, also in Kursk, it's a Russian drone targeting and striking a decoy BMP. So the decoys work, apparently. There you go. Now, I do also want to show some first-person footage from soldiers on the ground because, you know, we have a ton of drone footage, but at the end of the day, it's boots on the ground that are fighting this war day in and day out. This is the Russian Volunteer Corps, so it's a group of Russians fighting for Ukraine against Russia, and they're fighting the Vovchansk Aggregate Plant. This is about a month or two old and just came out in the last couple weeks. I wanted to show this in the next couple clips here to give you an idea of what some of these urban settings look like in the middle of this war. Again, we've got plenty of drone footage overhead showing just the level of destruction. But when you see this, it reminds me of what, you know, Soviet or German soldiers might have been going through in Stalingrad back in World War II. It's just city after city, town after town is just complete rubble. And one of the challenges that both Ukraine and Russian forces are facing in this situation is as the towns become more and more rubbleized, it can at times provide more locations for enemy forces, defenders, to sit there and dig into new locations. So, of course, we're seeing a lot of use of drones by both sides to try to clear out some of these pockets of resistance. And then on the Russian side especially, a lot of aircraft, especially their FAB or UMPK glide bomb kits. Now, this is another video from the Russian Volunteer Corps showing kind of a new tactic being used in this war, or we're seeing more of it now. They're taping a couple TM62 landmines together. These are anti-tank landmines, and they're being used as sort of a satchel charge of sorts. So they attach a fuse. We've seen Russian and Ukrainian forces lobbing these into buildings and defensive positions being held by enemy forces. That's a big boom. It's going to do the trick. And in the videos that we've seen to this point, it gets the job done. Then we've got a couple of videos here showing Ukrainian forces defending at Vuhledar, which fell to Russian forces not too awful long ago. I wanted to show this one because we see these Ukrainian forces at elevation, and this isn't all too common in this current war. You know, in video games and things, people tend to go to the very top to get the broadest field of view, to be able to shoot as far as they can, all that stuff. That's not really been the case in this war for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of traps you up high, right? There's a number of munitions that can strike any point in the building, bring it down, or target you without you being able to hide the higher up you go. Also, a lot of this observation from on high can be done easily with drones. So, you know, it's tempting at times to see these tall buildings and think the soldiers are probably running to the very top. That's not always the case, but of course, as we can see here in Vuhledar, there are still some advantages in certain defensive positions to take that elevated terrain with manpower and actually be able to fire down on, in this case, the advancing Russian forces. Now let's step back real quick and take a look at the overhead view of what cities like this look like after the fighting is complete. So this right here is Marinka. a city in eastern Ukraine that fell to Russian forces in late 2023. I mean, there's nothing left. Look, freedom isn't free. It's paid for by those brave enough to defend it. And today, millions of Ukrainians are living that reality, standing up and facing down Putin's invasion. This is the cost of freedom unfolding before our eyes. I've partnered with Alexandra Matveychuk, a global human rights defender, to remind as many people as possible that freedom and democracy are under attack today, and Ukraine is holding the front line in this fight. Here's a short clip from Alexandra.
Putin's army has unleashed unthinkable evil since invading Ukraine, torturing Christian leaders, destroying churches and burning Bibles, kidnapping thousands of Ukrainian children and holding them hostage in Russia, brutally assaulting and raping women of all ages. Freedom and democracy are under attack, and Ukraine is the front line. Freedom isn't free. Together, we must stand for justice.
Now, I did want to show some footage from the Russian perspective here as well. This right here is some helmet cam footage of Russian forces assaulting Novogradovka, which is a small town on the outskirts of Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine. This is generally an area that's been at the focus of the Russian assault over the course of the last few months. And I wanted to highlight this one because in the first clip showing the Russian Volunteer Corps, you'll see a tactic carrying over here in a second, that was more of an urban setting. The next clip is going to be more rural, showing BMPs dropping forces off in a woodline. This is kind of that middle ground, right? There's a small settlement, a small village, but you can still see the level of destruction. These homes are just entirely destroyed. And how challenging it would be to find enemy forces holed up throughout here as you're moving through in clearance, whether it's Russian forces advancing or Ukrainian forces trying to hold the Russian forces back. And at the end of this clip, you can actually see the Russians using that TM62 method where they're taping a couple landmines together, just like we saw the Russian Volunteer Corps doing in the previous video in Vovchansk. Now, the last clip here that I want to show is, again, more of a rural setting. We don't see this a lot, right? But this is a full-on Russian assault, start to finish, and they're attacking a tree line with a couple BMPs, or BMP and a BTR, near Trudov. Now, this is north of Vuhledar. Again, very rural setting when you look at this. This is a successful Russian assault. So what we can tell based off of what we're seeing here, it looks like there's Ukrainian forces in that tree line, probably dug into a series of trenches. You've got the Russian vehicles assaulting in broad daylight across relatively open terrain, which tells us some things I'll get to here in a moment, and suppressing Ukrainian forces with their main gun. So a key aspect here is this probably suggests that Ukrainian forces in this area are short artillery. We're not seeing any supporting artillery or mortars. We're not seeing any supporting drones. So whether they're short or whether they've been jammed, it's hard to tell just from what we can see here. But this is kind of a prime example of how Russian forces have been assaulting and kind of moving slowly forward bit by bit across the front. So they have an armored vehicle. In this case, sometimes it's not an armored vehicle, but they bring up the forces right up as close as possible to the Ukrainian positions. They dismount about a squad. That squad digs in, begins to fight, and as we'll see here in a moment, they bring up reinforcements if they're able to dig in and establish a toehold. Now, it's not that this tactic is all that new or unique, but it's just interesting. You know, we've got a major modern military with hundreds of thousands of people in the force at this point with a 12,000-kilometer front, and it's often easy to look at that and think of, you know, company, battalion, at least platoon-size assaults, when really it's much more like this. You're talking squad-size elements moving, 50, 100, 200 kilometers at a time, dropping off 10 people to, in this case, you see the Russian forces assaulting forward towards what appear to be, there we go, a couple Ukrainians on the right there. It's very localized, very small-scale fights, just playing out at a very large scale, if that makes sense. So we really, for a long time now, haven't seen, company of battalion-sized assaults with dozens or even hundreds of vehicles. It's all day, every day, little things like this up and down the line, and which over time becomes absolutely exhausting for the Ukrainian defenders. And here we've got the reinforcements coming up. Now, we've heard mixed stories on this. Sometimes Russia just does this over and over again until they establish a foothold, which can sacrifice multiple vehicles and countless men. Other times, there's as we're seeing here, the infantry are able to fight and hold and start to advance against the Ukrainian forces, and they call back, or maybe the drone in this case identifies what's happening, and the call goes back to send up a second squad to hopefully in this case, from the Russian perspective, take the Ukrainian position and be able to move their forces up just a little bit further. But I thought this was an interesting clip to show. Just we don't often see, we've seen a lot of videos like this where as soon as that God, I thought he was going to run that dude over. We've seen plenty of those at this point where the Russian armored vehicles just run over their troops after they dismount. Most of the videos we've seen like this are drones or artillery just knocking these vehicles out as they approach Ukrainian positions. Again, it kind of highlights in this case that there might be a shortage of that ammunition, not necessarily across the entire Ukrainian force, but definitely locally. And or the Russian forces through recon were able to find a specific area of the front where they would have some sort of local advantage to push these infantry forward into the attack. But that's all I've got for now. I'll put a link in the description below to Alexandra's page. You can read a little bit more about all of the very, very important work that she's doing. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.